The storm had finally blown itself to tatters, but Thomas's yard looked like the end of the world. His cattle, the few that were still standing, staggered in the churned mud. Steam rose off their backs like ghosts in the cold morning air. And then he saw them. Lying in the trampled grass, half buried in the muck, were two women. But these weren't ordinary women. They were motionless as fallen statues, enormous. Even lying down, you could tell they were built on a different scale. The one closer to him, she had to be well over 6 feet tall, built like a fortress gate. The other one, even in the mud, you could see she was longer, broader. She'd scrape 7 feet easy, a legend made of flesh and blood. Beads and silver flashed on their chests as the sun broke through the clouds. This wasn't cheap trade junk. This was the work of masters, the kind of finery you'd see in a chief's own lodge. Thomas took a step closer. Blood had dried black along the ribs of the shorter giant. The taller woman had a deep, ugly split across her brow, and her breath sawed in and out, a horrible sound like a blade cutting through green wood. They were highborn, they were badly hurt, and they were on his land. Every rule of the frontier screamed the same warning in his head. Help Apache, and you hang with them. It was the simple, brutal truth of this place. He knew it. He'd seen it. But he took another step closer anyway. The tall one's eyelids fluttered. Dark eyes found his. There was no hate in them, no rage, just that raw, pure fear he'd seen in a good horse with a broken leg, the kind of fear that knows the end is coming. Her lips moved, trying to form a word, a prayer, something. But the sound died in her throat. Thomas felt the noose tighten around his own neck, right then and there, just by looking, just by thinking about helping. His neighbors, they'd see the tracks, they'd invent the story. A poor rancher sheltering giants. That kind of tale only has one ending, and it's at the end of a rope. But fear, when it's honest, it has a look all its own. It broke across her face, a quiet tremble. A warrior's pride refusing to beg, while her body begged for her. His hand went to the rifle slung over his shoulder. The law was clear. Leave them. Walk away. His gut said something else. Breathe. Think. Do something. He looked from his dying cattle to the dying women, and he understood the real choice wasn't about the law. It was about him. Save his own hide or save a life. The taller one, Clara, he named her in his head without knowing why, she blinked once. A slow, deliberate blink, as if she was asking him, right then and there, which kind of man he was going to be. Thomas knelt in the mud, and the weight of that choice was heavier than the whole damn storm. Up close, the sheer size of them was staggering. They were carved from a different kind of wood than ordinary people. Their limbs were like timber, muscles built for a lifetime of war and survival. He'd seen enough dying things to know what it looked like, and it was staring right back at him from two sets of eyes. The younger one, the smaller of the two giants, was bleeding out fast. Something sharp had gone deep between her ribs. The ground under her was soaked black. Her breath rattled in her chest like a loose shutter in the wind. She had an hour, maybe less. He decided to call her Itel. The elder sister, Clara, had that gash across her brow, but her eyes were wide awake. They were fixed on him, filled with a predator's weariness, and under it, something else. A plea, hidden behind a wall of iron pride. He swallowed, his throat dry as dust. Helping them was suicide. Leaving them was survival. Then the taller woman spoke. Her voice was deep, hoarse, but it cut through the morning quiet with shocking strength. Help. Sister. Just 2 words. Broken. But they landed on Thomas's chest like a blacksmith's hammer. Sister. That word wasn't just a word to him. It was a ghost. He saw Elizabeth, his own little sister, lost to the fever 3 winters ago. He'd been helpless then, too. Too far from a doctor, too poor for real medicine, too weak to stop the shaking. Watching her fade away had branded a guilt onto his soul that never healed. And now, hearing this Apache giant, this warrior, use that same word, a memory uncoiled inside him like a venomous snake. He blinked, and for a heartbeat, the mud and blood of his yard blurred into Elizabeth's pale face, her small hand clutching his in the dark. He stumbled back, a hand pressed to his chest, caught between raw terror and a feeling that was dangerously close to duty. Every instinct he had screamed at him. Walk away. The law of this land was cruel, but it was simple. Help them, and you'll hang, if you're lucky. But staring at Clara's fierce eyes, at Itel's failing body, he knew another truth. If he walked away from this, he'd see Elizabeth's face in their place for the rest of his miserable life. He would never forgive himself. Thomas let out a curse, low and bitter, and dropped to his knees in the mud again. He slid his arms under Itel's shoulders. She was impossibly heavy, solid muscle and bone. It was like trying to lift a fallen steer. Fire shot through his back and arms, but he gritted his teeth and held on. Clara, swaying on her feet, bent down to grab her sister's legs. Even battered and bleeding, she towered over him. Her strength was terrifying, but right now, it was the only thing that could save them. Together, they hauled the younger giant toward his small, lonely cabin. Each step was like dragging the weight of his own damn coffin. The unconscious woman was a dead weight, threatening to crush him, but he just leaned into it, pushing forward. The cabin door was just ahead, and then a sick feeling lurched in his stomach. It was too narrow. He realized they couldn't carry her straight through. Her shoulders were too broad. They had to turn her sideways, carefully, trying to ease her through the gap without tearing that hole in her ribs open any wider. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dirt and the fear. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps beside him, her long black hair clinging to her face. But she never once faltered. They were almost inside. Just as they managed to get Itel's body halfway through the door, Clara's hand shot out and gripped his arm like a vice. "They come," she rasped, her eyes flashing toward the horizon. Thomas froze. He peered through a crack in the shutters, and he saw them. 5 riders cresting the southern ridge. Their horses were painted with dust, and the sun glinted off the rifles in their hands. Apache warriors. His mouth went bone dry. If they found 2 of their high-born women bleeding to death in a white man's cabin, there would be no questions, no bargaining, only a quick, brutal death. The wounded woman in his arms groaned, pulling his focus back to the here and now. Fresh blood was already seeping through the crude bandage Clara had pressed against her side. He had a choice to make, right now. Let her die and maybe save his own skin, or fight for her life and gamble with the only thing he had left. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut for half a breath. He could almost hear his sister's voice, a faint echo from years ago. "Don't let me go, Thomas." When he opened his eyes again, his decision was carved into him. He wasn't going to lose another sister. Not today. Not if he had the strength to stop it. He braced his shoulder under Itel's weight and heaved her the rest of the way into the cabin. Clara followed, her massive frame nearly filling the entire small room. Outside, the riders paused. They were scanning the valley, looking for something. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm was on its way. Inside, Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs with a grim, terrible clarity. There was no going back now. He was in this, all the way. The room stank of blood, wood smoke, and a fear so thick you could taste it. Thomas pressed a strip of torn shirt against Itel's ribs. His hands were shaking. The crimson soaked through the cloth faster than he could stop it. Clara leaned against the far wall, her towering frame draped in the flickering lamplight. Her body had to be moments from giving out, but her eyes never left him. They were sharp, steady, and full of questions. He had questions too, so many of them. But the silence between them was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Finally, the giant woman spoke. Her voice was deep, deliberate. Her broken English carried the weight of a long, hard life. She refused, she said, just like that. Thomas blinked, confused. Refused what? Marriage, Clara rasped. She tightened her grip on the bloodied cloth she was still pressing to her sister's wound. Chief's son. He wanted her. She said no. The simple words hit Thomas like a physical blow. All this, the blood, the chase, the danger, because a woman had said no to a powerful man. He thought about his own life, the freedom to walk away from a bad deal, from a job, from a whole town if he wanted. These women didn't have that freedom. To say no to the son of a chief, that was inviting a death sentence. His chest tightened. He looked at Etel's face, pale and slick with fever sweat. Her lips moved silently, trapped in some nightmare. She hadn't asked for a war. She hadn't started a rebellion. She had just said no, and for that they were hunted like animals. Clara's eyes narrowed. She was studying his face, trying to see if he could possibly understand the weight of what she was telling him. Then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a low whisper. "Not only marriage," she said. "More." Thomas frowned, leaning closer to hear her. "What do you mean, more?" Clara took a ragged breath. The words came slower now, heavier, as if each one was a sacred, dangerous secret. "River Girl," she whispered, "3 moons ago." Thomas froze. The name was like a spark hitting dry tinder. It ignited a memory he had tried to bury. A half-drowned Apache girl he'd found tangled in the roots by the creek while he was checking his traps. She couldn't have been more than 14. Her skin was hot with fever, her eyes rolling back in her head. He'd carried her back to his cabin. He'd stayed with her through the night, forcing broth and medicine down her throat. He'd kept her safe until she could stand on her own 2 feet. Then, without asking her name, without giving her his, he had pointed her back toward Apache territory and watched her go. He had never told a single soul. And now, staring into Clara's fierce, knowing gaze, the truth came crashing down on him like a tidal wave. That little girl. She wasn't just any girl. She was, his voice cracked. Chief's daughter, Clara confirmed. Each word was as sharp as a flint arrowhead. You saved her, left no name, asked no payment. Just gone. The small cabin seemed to tilt and spin around him. He remembered the fragile weight of that girl leaning on his arm. He remembered her whispered thanks in a language he barely understood, her small hand clutching the bundle of dried meat he'd given her. He hadn't thought anything of it. It was just common decency, an act of simple kindness. Now that forgotten act had come back to haunt him with the force of a thunderclap. Clara's gaze bored into him, fierce and unblinking. Chief Nalish swore a blood debt, a life for a life, but some warriors, they say no debt is owed to a white man. They come now to test the truth. Outside, the hoofbeats pounded closer, slow, deliberate, the sound of judgment arriving. Thomas's throat went tight. "So this, all of this, it's about me?" Clara gave a single, solemn nod. Her sister groaned softly beside them, but Clara never looked away from him. "You are the story," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The nameless man who saved the chief's daughter. Tonight, you prove the truth of that story, or you die with us." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. He thought he was just an unlucky bystander, a rancher who stumbled into someone else's trouble. But he wasn't. He was the center of it. He was part of an old debt, a fragile bridge between 2 worlds, and that bridge was balanced on his shoulders, about to snap. Outside, the riders' voices rose, sharp and angry against the wind. And inside, Thomas realized the blood debt wasn't just about a girl he'd saved by the river. It was about who he was going to be right now, in this room. And the pounding on his cabin door began. The pounding on the door shook the whole cabin. It was a frail structure, and each blow felt like it was going to bring the whole thing down. Dust sifted from the rafters. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. Thomas, though that wasn't his real name, felt his knuckles go white around his rifle. He knew 12 bullets wouldn't do a damn thing against the Apache warriors who had tracked blood right to his front porch. His name was Ezekiel Marsh, and he was a dead man. Clara, whose name he now knew was Ayanna, pressed her shoulder against the wall near the door. Even exhausted and bleeding, she was a towering presence. Her dark eyes burned with an urgent fire. "You cannot lie," she said, her English jagged but powerful. "Lie, and they burn us all alive. The truth is the only way." Ezekiel swallowed hard. Sweat was prickling under his shirt, even though a cold draft was snaking under the door. Every single instinct he had was screaming at him. Barricade the door. Deny everything. Fight. But Ayanna's gaze cut deeper than any knife. She wasn't asking him. She was commanding him, as if his next words would decide not just if they lived or died, but if he was a man worth saving at all. Outside, a voice boomed in Apache. It was followed by a knock so hard it nearly splintered the wood. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone perfectly. "Come out, or we're coming in." Ayanna leaned closer, her towering frame casting him in shadow. "Say the name. River Girl. Tell them the truth. Then we will see." He gave a slow nod, his throat as dry as a desert bone. For 3 months he had carried that secret. The half-drowned girl by the creek, the little bundle of dried meat he'd put in her hands, the long night he'd spent guarding her from predators while her fever burned. It had seemed like such a small thing, a simple act of mercy, forgotten as soon as she was gone. But now, with a band of warriors at his door ready to take his life, it was the only currency he had left to spend. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He raised his voice loud enough to be heard through the thin wooden walls. "My name is Ezekiel Marsh," he shouted. "3 moons ago I found Chief Nalish's daughter by the river. She was sick, near death. I gave her food and medicine, and I guided her back toward your lands. I asked for no payment. I gave no name, but I am that man." The silence that followed was so sudden, so complete, that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The pounding stopped. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in his hearth, ticking off the seconds between heartbeats. Through a thin crack in the shutters, Ezekiel saw movement. 5 riders sat on their horses, their painted faces all turned toward his little cabin. The leader, a man with gray streaks in his long black hair, leaned forward in his saddle. His gaze was sharp as a hawk's, scanning the cabin as if he could peel the walls away with his eyes. Finally, the man spoke. His English was accented but steady and clear. "Show yourself, Ezekiel Marsh. Bring the women also." Ayanna tightened her grip on her sister's arm, helping the wounded giant to her feet. The younger sister, Etel, swayed. She was pale from fever and blood loss, but she managed to stand, leaning heavily against her sibling. Ezekiel lifted the heavy bar from the door. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure the warriors outside could hear it. Then, slowly, he swung the door open. The night air rushed in, sharp and cold. 5 Apache warriors were waiting in his yard. Their horses stamped restlessly in the mud. Their war paint seemed to glow in the lantern light. They had rifles strapped across their backs, and knives glinted at their belts. But it wasn't raw hostility Ezekiel saw in their eyes. It was something else. Scrutiny. They were weighing his words, balancing truth against lies. The leader studied him for a long, excruciating moment. "You are smaller than the daughter described," he said, and his voice held a strange note of dry amusement. She said the white man was a giant who fought river spirits to save her. Despite the crushing tension, a rough laugh almost escaped Ezekiel's chest. "Children always make stories larger than life," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I'm no giant, just a rancher who found her tangled in some branches and helped her get free." The leader's gaze shifted to Ayanna and Itel. His expression darkened. "These two brought shame to the chief's son. Why did you help them?" Ezekiel steadied his voice, though his knees felt like they were about to buckle. "Because they needed help. Same reason I helped your chief's daughter. A life in danger is a life worth saving. It doesn't matter whose it is." The warriors exchanged glances, speaking quickly in their own language. Ezekiel couldn't catch any of the words, but he could read the tone. It was a mix of skepticism and a reluctant, grudging respect. Finally, the leader raised his hand, silencing the others. "Chief Nailish comes at sunrise," he declared. "He will decide if the blood debt covers the defiance of these women, or if you die with them." The pronouncement hung in the night air, heavy as a shroud. Sunrise was just hours away, and it would bring judgment. Ezekiel felt the weight of it settle in his chest like an anvil. The warriors wheeled their horses around and rode back into the darkness, their silhouettes vanishing over the ridgeline. The sound of their hooves echoed in the quiet, a drumbeat counting down the last hours of his life. Behind him, Ayanna helped her sister back inside, her massive presence once again filling the small cabin. "You spoke the truth," she said quietly. "Now we will see if the truth is enough." Ezekiel shut the door, his hands still trembling. He leaned his forehead against the rough wood. Sunrise was coming, and with it the verdict of a people he didn't understand, and the judgment of a chief whose daughter's life he had once held in his hands. The night crept on, slow and heavy. It felt like the darkness was pressing in on the walls of the little cabin. Thomas, he decided he was Thomas again, worked in silence. His hands were surprisingly steady as he cleaned and rewrapped the blood-stained cloth on Itel's ribs. Every movement was slow, deliberate, partly to keep from hurting her more, but mostly to keep the clawing thoughts at bay. Outside, the wind howled across the marshland. He could hear the distant cry of coyotes, sharp and hungry. Clara knelt beside her sister. Her tall frame was bent with a practiced skill as she tied off a fresh bandage. In the flicker of the lamp, her dark eyes held a weight that no warrior's posture could hide. She spoke quietly, her rough English cutting through the silence. "Chief's son asked Etel to be his wife. She said no. That is why the hunters came." Thomas glanced up, startled by how blunt she was. "Just for refusing?" Clara's jaw tightened. "He has 3 wives already, 2 of them beaten until they lost their children. My sister saw her fate. She would not give her life to that. Her refusal brought dishonor to him. He answers dishonor with blood." The words struck Thomas like a hammer. Out here, a man had the right to say no. To cattle buyers, to land speculators, even to the preacher if he got too pushy. But for these women, saying no to a marriage proposal was a death sentence. He looked at Itel's pale face, at the sweat streaking her temples. A quiet, burning fury rose in his chest. For a long time, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the fire popping in the stove and Itel's uneven, shallow breathing. Then, just after midnight, the younger woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. They were clear for the first time since he'd carried her inside. She shifted against the wall, a pained grimace on her face. In a halting whisper, she spoke. "Thank you." Thomas blinked, not sure what to say. Anyone would have done the same. But Clara's gaze shot to him, sharp and disagreeing. Etel, despite her weakness, managed a faint smile. "Not anyone. Many would have left us. You did not." The words landed with more weight than Thomas expected. He opened his mouth to deny it again, to say it was nothing, but he stopped, because Clara was watching him differently now. The suspicion was gone. The guarded vigilance of a warrior was gone. In its place was something else, something harder to define. Recognition. Respect. It was as if she had taken his measure, and for the first time found something worth acknowledging. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the air thick with everything that wasn't being said. Thomas went back to fussing with the bandages, though his hands were trembling slightly now. Outside, the wind shifted, and with it came a new sound, hoofbeats echoing across the valley, slow at first, then growing louder, deliberate, confident. Thomas's stomach plummeted. The Apache had said they'd be back at dawn. It was hours too early. Clara moved to the window in a single fluid motion. Her tall body was as tense as a drawn bowstring. She peered out into the darkness, then pulled back with a sharp hiss. "Not my people," she whispered, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. "White men. 3 riders." Thomas's blood turned to ice. Settlers could be neighbors, but they could also be a mob. And then, as the riders broke into the clearing, the lamplight from his window caught the cold, hard gleam of badges pinned to their coats. Federal marshals. The lead rider's voice rang out, sharp as a gunshot in the night. "Marsh, we know you're in there. Come out, slow. Hands where we can see them." Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't the Apache. It wasn't Dawn. The judgment of Chief Nailish hadn't come yet. Instead, the law had arrived. His law. And it had come at the worst possible moment. Inside the cabin, Clara stood rigid, her eyes flicking from the door to her wounded sister. The long, dangerous night had just found a way to get a whole lot worse. The pounding on the door grew harder, each strike a drumbeat of doom. Thomas rose slowly, his rifle in his hand. Clara shifted her towering frame, placing herself protectively in front of her sister. The call came again, sharp and commanding. "Marsh, we know you're in there. Come out slow, hands where we can see 'em." Through a narrow gap in the shutter, Thomas saw 3 riders dismounting in his yard. The moonlight glinted off the badges on their coats. Deputy Marshal Kane, leading 2 other federal men. Their boots sank into the mud as they spread out, their hands resting on their pistols. They moved like predators, waiting for the slightest twitch. Kane's voice was full of the confidence that comes from having the law and a gun on your side. "We got reports of Apache in this area. Tracking party says they came this way after the Morrison place was hit." Thomas's blood ran cold. The Morrison place. If settlers had been attacked, the whole territory would be screaming for Apache blood. Any they found nearby would be shot first, and questions would be a distant afterthought. Inside the cabin, Clara stiffened. Even injured, she coiled with a dangerous strength. Her very presence in his home was a challenge to the men outside. Thomas pushed the door open just a crack and stepped into the lamplight, leaving the sisters in the shadows behind him. He blocked the entrance with his body, trying to look both small and immovable at the same time. "Haven't seen any Apache," he said, his voice even. "Storm left my cattle half dead. Maybe those are the tracks you're seeing." Kane squinted at him, his eyes already full of suspicion. He gestured to one of his men. "Check the porch." The deputy crouched low, sweeping his lantern over the muddy ground. The yellow light fell on the dark stains near the threshold, stains that were still tacky. "Marshal," the man called out, "this ain't cow blood, and there's too much of it. And look here, prints." He pointed at the ground. There, in the mud, were enormous footprints, far larger than any settler's boot could have made. Kane strode forward. His face tightened as he looked at the size of those tracks. His gaze snapped back to Thomas, cold and sharp as broken glass. "What kind of people have you been hiding in there, Marsh?" Thomas's jaw flexed. I don't know what you mean." In a flash, Kane's pistol was out of its holster and aimed at Thomas's chest. "Step aside. We're searching your place." Thomas forced steel into his own voice, even though his heart was trying to beat its way out of his chest. "You got a warrant for that?" Kane's lip curled into a sneer. "Don't need a warrant when we're hunting Indian killers. The law gives us the authority to act before more settlers get butchered. Now stand aside, or I'll put you in chains and burn that cabin to the ground with whatever's inside it." Behind the door, Thomas heard Clara shift. He didn't have to look to know what she was doing. She was preparing to fight. One wrong move, and his yard would be soaked in blood long before sunrise. His mind was racing. He could lie again. Say the blood was his own, that he'd cut himself with an axe. But Kane's men weren't fools. They'd already seen the prints. They knew. The noose was tightening. Thomas took a deep breath. He lowered his rifle, but not his resolve. "You're right," he said quietly, his words sharp as a blade. "There are Apache here, 2 women, badly injured. They came to me for help, and I gave it. Same as I'd do for anyone." Kane's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed into a furious glare. "So it's true. You're nothing but an Apache sympathizer. Around here, that'll get you hanged quicker than horse theft." The other marshals exchanged looks, their hands tightening on their own guns. It was a death sentence, that accusation. Thomas knew it, but even as fear clawed at his guts, he stood a little straighter. Better to be condemned for doing the right thing than praised for being a coward. From inside the cabin, Clara's deep voice rumbled, steady as bedrock. "He helped us because we were dying." The cabin, the yard, the whole damn valley seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick and heavy, a coiled spring ready to snap. Kane's pistol never wavered from Thomas's chest. The standoff was absolute. And then a new sound broke the silence, the distant thunder of hooves rolling across the night. Every head in the yard turned toward the northern ridge. A cloud of dust was rising against the stars. More riders were coming. The marshals shifted uneasily, their rifles swinging toward the horizon. They didn't know if it was reinforcements or enemies on the way. Thomas's stomach twisted into a knot. If it was more lawmen, his fate was sealed. He'd be swinging from a tree before sunrise, a convicted sympathizer. If it was Apache, his yard was about to become a battlefield, with him trapped right in the middle. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until silhouettes appeared through the gloom. It wasn't settlers, it wasn't a war party, it was more federal riders. Reinforcements summoned by Kane. 6 more men dismounted, their movements brisk and efficient. They surrounded his property, a tightening noose of law and order. Kane's sneer returned, his confidence swelling with the strength of his numbers. "Now we've got enough to do this right," he growled. "Search every building. Bring out anyone you find hiding inside. Tonight, we end this." Before Thomas could say another word, the cabin door swung open behind him. Clara stepped out into the lamplight. Her massive frame filled the doorway, her presence so commanding that even the hardened lawman faltered. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her dark eyes blazing with a fierce dignity. Her wounded sister, Eitel, leaned heavily against her side. The sight brought the entire yard to a dead halt. Kane's men just gaped. They had never seen Apache women like this, giants wrapped in beadwork that glittered with the pride of their ancestors. Their posture was regal, even with bloodied bandages wrapped around them. The night air itself seemed to tremble as Clara's voice rang out, her English deep and clear. "I am Clara, daughter of Chief Naelish," she declared. Every syllable vibrated with authority. "This man, Thomas Marsh, saved my sister's life when death was upon her. Under Apache law, his mercy binds him to us through a blood debt, and under the treaty your own government signed, Apache law must be honored. The words struck the gathered marshals like a physical blow. Kane lowered his rifle just a fraction, but his expression darkened, torn between disbelief and a growing unease. "Blood debt," he spat. "That's Indian superstition, nothing more. Federal law rules this territory." But even as he said it, his voice lacked the iron certainty it had held just moments before. The other marshals were exchanging uncertain glances. They'd all heard whispers of the blood debt among the Apache, an obligation so sacred that even rival war bands were known to respect it. To defy a claim like that would be like spitting on the very treaty Washington had signed to keep the fragile peace. Clara took a deliberate step forward, her towering figure radiating a calm, unbreakable defiance. "Federal law recognizes our customs in matters concerning our own people," she said, her tone as steady as stone. "Your own governor signed the treaty last winter. My father's word carries weight, both among our nation and among yours. If you take us now, you break not only Apache law, but your own." Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Her words weren't just a plea, they were a strategy. She was weaving together threads of tradition and politics into an unbreakable net. Clara wasn't just defending herself. She was putting the marshals on trial. Kane's jaw tightened. Sweat glistened on his temple despite the cold night air. He knew she was right. The treaty was real. It had been signed reluctantly, but it was legally binding. If he defied it here, and if Chief Nalish chose to make an issue of it, the fallout could ignite a war across the entire frontier. But to back down now in front of his men would be to admit weakness. "You think your words tie my hands?" Kane snapped, though his voice cracked just a little under the strain. "This territory belongs to federal law, not to some savage's stories." A small, cold smile touched Clara's lips. It was the same confidence he'd seen in her when she stood between him and danger. "Then why does your badge tremble when I speak the truth?" she countered softly. "You know what the treaty says. And you know my father will come at sunrise. Until then, by Apache law, and by your own, we remain under the protection of Thomas Marsh." His name echoed in the still night like a verdict. Kane's men shifted uneasily. Their resolve was crumbling. The legal and moral ground was slipping out from under them. One of them muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "She's right, Kane. If they're really Chief Nalish's daughters, we'd best wait for him. Washington won't thank us for starting a war over this." Kane turned on his subordinate with a glare that could have cut steel, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The lawman's authority was unraveling right before the eyes of his own men, and Clara knew it. She held herself even taller, her wounded sister at her side, a living testament to endurance and honor. Finally, with a hiss of pure frustration, Kane holstered his rifle. "Fine. We'll wait for your chief. But if he doesn't show, or if his decision doesn't satisfy federal law, all three of you are coming with us. And no Apache treaty is going to save you then." Thomas exhaled slowly, the relief mixing with a cold dread of what the dawn would bring. He glanced at Clara. Her steady presence seemed to be holding back the night itself. She had turned the tide, not with a weapon, but with words. She had wielded truth and law as deftly as any blade. The marshals withdrew to the edge of the yard, posting sentries, preparing for the long, tense vigil. The firelight flickered across their uneasy faces. Inside the cabin, Thomas, Clara, and Itel braced themselves for the judgment that sunrise would deliver. They had won a reprieve, but the real trial was still to come. The first pale light of dawn crept across the valley. It stained the horizon in streaks of amber and blood red. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every breath felt heavier. Thomas stood in his doorway, his shoulders stiff from a night without sleep. Beside him, Clara towered like a sentinel, her massive frame casting a long, commanding shadow across the yard. Her wounded sister, Etel, leaned against the doorpost for support, but her dark eyes were still sharp, as if daring the new day to strike first. Marshal Kane emerged from behind his barricade, his rifle back in his hands. His voice was harsh with suspicion. "That better be your chief, woman," he called out to Clara, his eyes flicking to the dust clouds rising in the distance. "Because if that's a war party, we start shooting." Clara straightened to her full, daunting height. She was unflinching, even with nearly a dozen rifles pointed in her direction. Her deep voice carried across the cold morning air. "My father comes as promised. He will speak with the authority of Apache law, and your federal law, both." The hoofbeats grew closer, and then the riders emerged from the dust. It wasn't the marauding war band Kane had feared. It was Chief Nailish himself, riding with 5 tribal elders. They were men of great age and solemn bearing. Their faces were painted for ceremony, not for war. They approached slowly, deliberately. Every movement declared their dignity and control. Nailish dismounted with the fluid ease of a man born to command. He was well into his 50s, but his frame carried the wiry strength of a lifetime of survival. But it was his eyes that captured every man in the yard. They were keen, calculating, and absolutely unflinching. They met Kane's gaze with neither fear nor hostility, only the calm assurance of a leader who had come to measure the worth of words, not bullets. "Marshal Kane," the chief said in perfect English, somehow knowing the man's name without being told. "You hold my daughters as prisoners. This creates a problem between our peoples." His voice was quiet, yet it rippled with an authority that felt like the low growl of distant thunder. Kane stepped forward, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Your daughters murdered settlers at the Morrison place. They're wanted for questioning under federal law." Nailish's jaw tightened. His reply was measured but dangerous. "Morrison tried to force himself on my daughters. They defended their honor. Apache law justifies their actions. And your federal treaty recognizes Apache law in matters involving members of my tribe." The yard fell silent, frozen under the weight of the exchange. This wasn't a fight with guns. It was a battle of words, sharpened to a razor's edge. Kane pressed, unwilling to yield. "Even if that's true, this rancher here broke federal law. He harbored fugitives, and that crime is clear-cut." For the first time, Chief Nailish turned his gaze on Thomas. It was so piercing, Thomas felt like he was being stripped bare before a council of gods. "You are Thomas Marsh," Nailish said slowly. "3 moons ago, you pulled my youngest daughter from the drowning waters and gave her back her life." "Yes," Thomas swallowed, his throat suddenly tight. "Yes, sir. I found her by the creek. I gave her food, some medicine, and sent her home." Nailish's voice rose, carrying across the armed men in the waiting dawn. "For this, Apache law says I owe you a blood debt. A life for a life. But last night you also saved 2 more of my daughters when they were dying. This makes the debt complicated." Clara stepped closer to Thomas, her immense presence radiating both pride and a fierce protectiveness. "Chief," she said formally, her voice echoing like a drumbeat, "this man risked everything for us. His heart is true, his courage is proven. He deserves our respect." Nailish nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing in thought. From his saddlebag he drew a necklace of carved bone and shimmering silver. The elders stirred. An object like that was reserved only for the highest bloodlines. It was a symbol of belonging, binding families together across generations. 3 lives saved, Nailish declared, lifting the necklace for all to see. "This creates an obligation beyond a simple blood debt. Apache law offers only one path for such a thing. Thomas Marsh, you are worthy of adoption into my family. By your deeds and by your honor, you become my son." The declaration hit the yard like a bolt of lightning. Kane's face twisted in disbelief. You can't just adopt an American settler and claim him as Apache. That's not law, that's trickery. Nalish turned his calm gaze back to the marshal. The federal treaty allows for Apache adoption. Your own law protects adopted family members from persecution. My son now shares my bloodline under Apache law, and federal law must respect it. Kane's rifle trembled in his hands. This is madness. You're making him untouchable. No, Nalish corrected softly, a faint, cunning smile on his lips. I am making him family, and family is not touched by its enemies. The marshals shifted, unease spreading through their ranks like a disease. They knew the treaty was real. They knew Washington had bound them to respect it. To strike at Thomas now would be to strike at Chief Nalish himself, and not a single man there wanted to be responsible for reigniting the Apache Wars. Kane's fury was boiling over, but he was trapped. His authority was shrinking by the second, eroded by a law he couldn't twist and an honor he couldn't deny. With a visible, shaking effort, he forced his rifle down, spitting his words like venom. Fine, but don't think this ends here. There will be federal investigations. You'll answer for this. Nalish's eyes gleamed with a quiet, certain confidence. Let them come. Apache law is clear. The federal treaty honors Apache law. My son and my daughters are under tribal protection now. He stepped forward and placed the heavy, ornate necklace around Thomas's neck. The weight of it felt like both a chain and a liberation. It bound him to a people he had never imagined belonging to, yet it offered him a protection greater than any badge or law book ever could. Kane's lips curled in disgust, but he was beaten. He had been completely outmaneuvered. His only choice was to holster his weapon and ride away, muttering curses into the morning air. His men followed, though some of their faces held a look of reluctant respect for what they had just witnessed. When the dust of their departure finally settled, the yard fell silent. The only sound was the steady breathing of the horses. Clara stood at Thomas's side, her dark gaze resting on him with an unspoken, powerful emotion. The necklace gleamed against his chest. It was proof that he was no longer just a poor rancher on the edge of the world. He was kin to the Apache, adopted son of a chief, brother to the towering woman beside him. In that single moment, Thomas realized his life had been changed forever. What began as a simple act of mercy had become a covenant, sealed by honor, by law, and by blood. And as the morning sun burned hot on his face, it felt like the beginning of a life he had never, ever dared to imagine. Months passed. The dawn when Chief Nalish placed the adoption necklace around Thomas's neck felt like a lifetime ago. What had started as a desperate act of survival had grown into something far larger than he could have ever imagined. His once failing ranch was now a thriving trading post. Apache families traveled for days to exchange pelts, corn, and handmade goods with the settlers who now dared to travel under the protection of the treaty. The federal officials, still bitter about being outplayed, found themselves powerless to interfere. Every transaction, every deal, was shielded by both tribal and federal law. Thomas worked harder than he ever had in his life, but he was no longer alone. Clara, towering over everyone, moved with the strength of 3 men and the quiet dignity of a born leader. Her sister, Etel, now fully healed and just as formidable, handled the negotiations with a sharp intelligence that often left seasoned traders wide-eyed and agreeing to terms they hadn't planned on. The 3 of them, this unlikely partnership, had built something new, something that drew both settlers and tribes together. What began as a fragile, desperate alliance had blossomed into shared prosperity. But amidst the steady rhythm of work and trade, something else was stirring, something unspoken, yet impossible to deny. Every day Thomas spent beside Clara deepened a bond that neither of them could ignore. He found himself watching the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, the graceful precision in her every movement, the quiet power behind her gaze. At night, when the fires crackled and the sounds of laughter and trade filled the yard, he would sometimes find her eyes meeting his across the flames. There was no mistaking the warmth that lingered there. Thomas wrestled with it in silence. Under Apache law, Clara was now his sister. The adoption had saved him. It had saved them all. But it had also bound his heart in chains of propriety. To love her would be to betray the very law that had made him family. And Clara, though her face revealed little, was not blind. She carried her own feelings with the discipline of a warrior. But Eitel often saw it. The way her sister would linger near Thomas longer than duty required. The way her expression would soften when she thought no one was watching. It was Chief Nalish who finally broke the silence. He returned months later, and his wise old eyes missed nothing. He saw the thriving post. He saw the respect Thomas now commanded from both peoples. And he saw the unspoken tension woven through every single glance between his adopted son and his eldest daughter. He dismounted with the quiet dignity of a man who had come to settle not just disputes of law, but matters of the heart. "My son," Nalish began, his deep voice steady and calm, "you have honored the adoption well. The Apache people see your worth. You have given my daughters protection. You have kept them safe." He paused, his gaze narrowing with a subtle, cunning calculation. "But I am an old man, and old men sometimes solve one problem only to create another." Thomas's chest tightened. He knew before the words were even spoken that Nalish had seen the truth. The adoption had given him a new life, but it had chained his heart to silence. "When I made you brother to my daughters," the chief continued, "I solved the problem of the law, but I believe I created a problem of the heart." He gestured toward Clara, whose massive figure stood as still as a stone statue beside Thomas. "She is a warrior, trained to fight and to lead, but she is also a woman, and a woman must choose her own path." The air in the yard grew taut. Every elder, every settler was watching, frozen in anticipation. Clara stepped forward. Her voice was strong, but it was edged with a vulnerability Thomas had never heard before. "Chief," she said, "I choose to speak." "Speak then, my daughter," Nalish granted. Her words rang out, clear and true, carrying across the entire yard. "This brother has shown honor beyond any man I have ever known. His courage is proven, his heart is true, but my heart, it does not see him as a brother. My heart sees him as a man." The admission fell like a spark on dry grass. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. The elders stiffened. The settlers shifted uneasily. Thomas himself felt his breath catch in his lungs. Chief Nalish, however, only smiled. The cunning of a seasoned leader glinted in his eyes. "Apache law has a solution for this as well," he declared. "A brother who proves himself worthy can be released from the family bond by the word of the chief, if the other family agrees." He turned his gaze to Eitel. "Younger daughter, what say you?" Eitel, tall and strong, straightened to her full height. Her voice carried with absolute certainty. "I release Thomas Marsh from the bond of brotherhood. He has earned the right to choose his own path, and my sister has waited long enough for her own joy." She smiled, her towering presence softened by a deep affection. Nalish lifted his staff, his authority absolute. "Then I speak the final decision. Thomas Marsh is released from adoption. He is no longer my son by law." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the final, stunning blow. "But if he chooses, he may become my son by marriage, if my giant daughter agrees to have him." The yard erupted in whispers, shock rippling through the crowd like thunder. The federal marshals who still lingered at the edges of the post shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly what this meant. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a political alliance, cementing law, blood, and land into one unbreakable union. Thomas turned to Clara. For the first time, the chains around his heart simply fell away. "Clara," he said, his voice soft, but filled with a conviction that came from the deepest part of his soul. "From the moment I lifted your sister from the mud, I was bound to your family. But what binds me to you now is not duty. It is not law. It is love. If you will have me, I will walk your path with you as your husband, not as your brother." Clara's gaze, dark and luminous, met his without wavering for a single second. "I will have you," she said simply, and the words were heavier and more powerful than any vow ever spoken. And so the ceremony began. It was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Apache traditions intertwined with territorial law. The elders painted Thomas's hands with ochre and ash, binding them to Clara's with strips of woven leather. A nervous preacher from the nearest town, summoned for the sake of legality, read from his book as settlers looked on in stunned awe. When Clara stood before them all in a traditional wedding dress, her towering frame adorned with beadwork and silver, every single witness knew they were watching a legend being born. The kiss they shared wasn't one of wild passion, but of quiet promise, a sealing of two worlds into one. Etel, grinning from ear to ear, served as the witness, her joyous laughter echoing across the valley, chasing away the last shadows of war. In the months that followed, the trading post prospered beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Settlers and Apache alike traveled for hundreds of miles to see the giant sisters and the white rancher who had become their family, first by law and then by love. The federal investigations, once promised with such fury, dissolved into silence. Washington saw the wisdom in fostering peace over politics, and Marshal Kane's threats evaporated like dust on the wind. As Thomas stood watching Clara direct the construction of their new, expanded home, her massive figure radiant in the afternoon sun, he finally understood the true brilliance of her father. Nalish had not only protected his daughters, he had orchestrated a union that had transformed enemies into kin, suspicion into strength, and mere survival into a thriving, prosperous future for them all. He had learned that some of the greatest blessings arrive disguised as impossible complications. For Thomas, the two giant sisters lying half dead in his yard had brought him not just safety and prosperity, but a love and a place in a world far larger and richer than he had ever dreamed was possible. What had seemed like the end of his world that day had only been the beginning. If you enjoyed this story and you believe that one act of kindness can change the world, don't forget to subscribe. We've got more stories coming that prove it.